Welcome to Crowdfunding Nerds. Today we're talking about motivation, cutting out distractions, accountability, and just working on projects when you don't feel like it. Let's get into it.
Game begin.
Let's go.
You have my bow.
Am I ad?
That's awesome.
Well, welcome, folks, to this episode of Crowdfunding Nerds. Andrew's not with us today because he is on his vacation, having a wonderful time in California with the family. But I'm joined today by Donnie. How you doing, Donnie?
Hi. I'm doing well, I think, so far. Not bad.
So Donnie is on the Crowdfunding Nerds team. He manages a lot of the ad accounts, also keeps on top of our billing because that's something that is can often go on fire. It's a lot of work keeping on top of that, making sure everyone is being billed and that's all going through.
Yeah.
But Donnie,
I get to send the unfriendly emails like, hey, you need to pay your bill.
Yes, yeah. But one reason I wanted to have you on this episode is that I know you've been working on a special project, a personal project of yours that you've been doing for quite a while. And I figured it'd be worth bringing you on because whenever you're dealing with a project that takes a long time and a lot of effort to produce, you're inevitably going to just fall into like this creator despair where you just don't want to work on the thing anymore, but you kind of need to and have to. And I think a lot of our listeners can sort of empathize with that frustration or that feeling, because when you have a Kickstarter or you're developing a game, there, at the start there's all this enthusiasm, but that slowly wanes when the reality of work sets in. So we kind of just want to outline some advice or some tips of how do you push through those kind of creative blocks and actually finish a project and do it well. So I don't know if you want to just introduce yourself in terms of what you've been working on and where it currently is.
Sure. Yeah. So my main project I've been working on is kind of a literary experience that we're trying to tool around. But essentially it's a story. It's, like a novel and such. And it's called Serafima, the Convergence of Fireflies. And it's this story of this little mouse and his cousin and his best friend. And this kind of journey they go on throughout this world. Without getting too detailed into it, we're still working on a few things. But yeah, I've been working on the concept I've had the concept in my mind for about 14 years. But the last 2 years I've been actively like, all right, we're going to sit down, we're going to get through the rough draft. And this last year just finished the first draft. I finished it a week ago, I think, tomorrow. And so it's like, okay, I had this idea for a long time and I actually set it aside for about a decade. And deciding to pick it back up again, it was that first part is very daunting. It's like, okay, this is the thing I set down, and then like starting to dust off old notes and notebooks and things. I had like 6 journals of ideas and stuff, and it originally started as, well, it took a couple different incarnations. It originally started as a comic idea, and then around that same time is when I got really into board gaming and tabletop games in general. It's like, okay, this could make a really good tabletop game. So I was producing it that direction. And so the tabletop game I'd been working on for about 3 years before I focused my efforts on the story side of it. And the reason I did that is because every step I made in the game, I was like, well, I have a location. It's like it was an adventure style card game. So it's like, I have to have these characters in these locations. And so it came down to, well, I need to have a story. I need to do that. So I set that aside and just focused on the writing aspect of it. Which, again, like you mentioned, in theory, it sounds like, okay, I can sit down and write this and like, yeah, it'll be no problem. I got the whole thing in my head, right? Until you realize, oh, wait, these characters need to talk. These characters need to interact with their environment. The reader needs to know where they are. Because I know where they are. I know what it looks like in my head, but how do I describe it? How do I bring the reader in? So it's like, okay, well, what do we do? And there's been a couple pieces of advice that really helped me because it can be daunting. And one of the things I started out early on was like, I'm going to keep this thing in the fun place where It's like, okay, where things like this, you can kind of get overwhelmed and you start stressing yourself out. Where when you stress yourself out, your brain doesn't work the same way, right? It's like, because you go into almost like a fight or flight mode. It's like, okay, right now it's survival, and you can force your brain into trying to be creative in this stuff. Um, but I found, like, when I'm forcing my mind to do that, it never works. It doesn't work. Um, and again, I'm speaking for myself. I know a lot of people that, like, when it comes down to like The Wire, they like perform beautifully. Like, they'll just go and they'll write out a 10-page essay the night before. I'm like, I've never been able to do that. So that's something that's really helped me. It's like, okay, how do I keep this thing in the fun category that I enjoy doing? Um, and a couple pieces of advice that actually helped with, if we jump back around to like the starting of it, right? Like, okay, you have this idea. It's like, okay, yeah, it sounds great. But then when you actually go to type it out or write it out, or
It's no
design
longer
it,
fun.
yeah, it's like, oh wait, how do I even start? There's two pieces of advice that I really liked. One was from, he's a radio host and a writer. His name is Brant Hansen, but he said that I like, give yourself permission to make something badly. Because a lot of times that can be our hang up, right? It's like, oh, it's not perfect. Yeah, it's like, well, your first draft, your first design, your first whatever, your first pass at anything won't be perfect. It's just not going to be, because there are those little things that we just don't think about. And the second piece of advice I got from Dan Povenmire, who, if people don't know who he is the creator of Phineas and Ferb. He's been in animation for like 40 years or something. Essentially, like, if you were a kid in the 90s, he had his hand somewhere in a cartoon you watched. But he said it best. It's like, you can't edit something if it isn't written. You can't fix a design, like if you're talking about a board game, or you can't fix a story if it's not written down. You can't go back and edit it. It just lives in your mind. So those two things, I was like, okay, that really gave me the key to kind of unlock, to keep this fun, to keep it in this place where it's like, okay, what am I going to do? Another thing that helped me is I didn't really have a deadline, because this is my first story. Like, I don't have a publisher waiting, like, TikTok, Donnie, you got to get this in. It's like, I don't have that right now.
Do you find that was
But
maybe a disadvantage because there wasn't a timeline? So the tendency to procrastinate crept in, or did you find that was more helpful in terms of not having any pressure to keep
there,
it fun?
it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, it's kind of like, you need that pressure. It's like, okay, because it's never going to get done, right? So I actually gave myself timelines. So for the final draft was like, okay, by November 1st, I want to be done. And I missed that by about a month and a week, Um, but that gave me a goal. It's like, okay, if I can write at least a third of it, or if I can go through with the first draft, at least 1/3 of a chapter, it gave me, like, okay, like 1/3 of a chapter a day. Because I was only writing for 5 days a week. Part of keeping it fun, right? I didn't do it every day, because it would be a daunting task at that point. It's like, no, I had built-in days where it's like, I can sleep in, you know. So that was a big thing. It's like, okay, it's like, I gave myself a goal, but that was still an arbitrary goal. It's like, okay, that gives me a target to shoot for, that doesn't have anyone depending on me at that moment, but it gives me something, kind of tricks my brain into, like, I want to get to that point, you know. Um, I think when it comes to the other side of it is like doing it. Okay, so we have our goal. For me, I found the best time for me to write was in the morning. I was most creative kind of first thing in the morning. So I would get up at. I'm to a point now where I get up at 5:30 rather regularly, for a number of reasons. One of which, Crowdfunding Nerds, everybody else is Midwest and towards Europe and China, like, and I'm kind of on the edge over here with a couple of our team members. So it's like, I'm the last one up. So it's like, okay, sometimes I got to get up early to get to work if I need to talk to, Sean or somebody who's, 6 hours ahead of me, before he's putting his kids down or what have you, you know.
Yeah.
But I didn't start at getting up at 5:30. I started by getting up at 6:55, you know. It's like, okay, I'm going to just slowly do, because that's the thing we kind of get stuck in when it comes to motivation, right? Is okay, I'm motivated. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to write this thing, and it's like, all right, cool. You got a lot of motivation, but the next day it's like, okay, I have a little more motivation. I did a lot yesterday, so I'm really tired. I got up at 4 a.m. It's like, okay, next day, like, okay, I'm just going to try it again, and then you're like half asleep at your keyboard because your body's not used to that. You haven't built a discipline yet, right? And so it's like that motivation wanes when you're not building in a discipline. And I found for me, it's like, okay, training myself to get up early took me months. Took me like 6 months to get to the point of getting up at 5:30 comfortably. Where it's like, okay, and part of that was, okay, I'm gonna, as I get up earlier, like I said, I started by getting up at like 6:55, and I did that for like 2 weeks. So it wasn't even like one day 6:55, next day 6:50. It's like, no, I'm gonna stay at 6:55, just 5 minutes earlier, and till my body gets used to that. It's like, okay, now I'm gonna add another 5 minutes. But then on the other side, I was like, okay, I need to stop staying up till midnight. So I'm gonna try and go to bed a little earlier. So you're kind of just slow. So I just slowly shifted my time schedule, but it took discipline. And that can kind of be a scary word because we've all been disciplined, right? By getting in trouble or so I guess. So we kind of see it as like this negative word. But actually Terry Crews said it one time because he was talking about his kids he's like, discipline isn't punishment. We've kind of made it that word. Discipline is training, right? You're being a disciple, right? When you're a disciple, you're being trained under somebody, right? That's where that word kind of comes from, per my understanding, so when we're disciplining ourselves, we're training ourselves for something, right? And that takes effort, and that takes, it can start with some motivation, but then breaking it down into bite-sized chunks. It's like, okay, like what's my goal? What's my goal for this morning with writing? I allowed myself that there were some days I was half awake and I would just write one sentence, and I would come back the next day and it wouldn't make any sense because I was half awake, right? Like, but again, just in doing that, I distinctly remember really early on, my eyes would be closed and I was just typing, and I was just lost in like half awake, half asleep, like in that mode at 6:55, at 6:45, because it was at the start of like, okay, I'm starting to wake up a little earlier, and it didn't make sense, but I was still writing. So those are things that kind of helped me. It's like, if I keep it fun, so even because the story I love Redwall, I love like Mouse Guard and the Mice Templar and like Green Ember and all these like anthropomorphic stories. Narnia did it really well, so I loved that idea. I was like, okay, like I would love to dive in that world. So it was already like an interest to me because it was something I enjoyed reading, so that kind of made it easier to keep it in the fun zone. But yeah. And then if there were times where like it felt like it's like, okay, I'm forcing myself to do this, I would do something minimal. Like, okay, what's minimal I can do here? And then rest. Like, science has shown a lot that it's like we need rest. Like our bodies need it, our brains need it. We have to rest. And then we even think about, even scripturally, it's like, okay, there was a built-in Sabbath. It's like, okay, you need to rest, like because we can push ourselves so hard because we're trying to attain something. We're trying to make ourselves something, and like that should never be a target. To accomplishment should never be the target. It's like so finding your reason why, is very important.
So what I'm hearing here is that you really need a timer, because it sounds like you had a set time each day, and there was probably a hard cutoff point where you had to, okay, I have to put this away now. I got to get and do my other responsibilities. So that's probably one thing for the listeners, and even for myself, because I've got a big daunting task that I've got to get through. I'm trying to cut a new Crowdfunding Nerds course, and I find it difficult to sit down whilst kind of juggling all the other work commitments. And it'd probably be better if I didn't try to do it after I, went through my emails and got back to clients, because I find by that time I'm pretty much spent, like energy wise and kind of like even mental space wise. It's probably best if I, like you were saying, had a timer where, okay, I'm going to spend the first 30 minutes of my day tackling this, and I'll just do a little each day, and then, as you said, try and gradually increase that. But that's probably worthwhile. So that's my big takeaway so far is having discipline in terms of having a schedule and a set time and a hard limit. And so, do you have like a stopwatch, or do you just in your mind you just have like, oh yeah, I finish at this time and I start at this time each day?
I mean, when I first I was like, okay, I need a hard stop because I have to get to work, right? So that means, okay, and then I have, it's my dog and my cats they're in the routine now. So it's like, I have to feed my dog by 6 every morning. It's like, my cat now wakes me up at like 4:00. So it's like, okay, I don't even really need an alarm clock anymore. But when I first really started, I did have, I was like, okay, my hard cutoff is like 7:30. That gives me time to take a shower, get ready for the day, all that stuff, take care of the animals. And I was able to do that because that was about the time my kids started to get up and we're homeschooling. So I was like, okay, that gives me time then to okay, what needs to be prepped for the day? And then when I started on here earlier this year, it's like, okay, I want to make sure I'm clocked in by 8. So it's like, okay, that means I have to be done writing by 7:15 to give me time to kind of prep for the day, to give me time to get myself ready for the day. But you touched on something really interesting, Sean, that I was thinking about, and I've thought about it only the last month or so, which was you mentioned you would dive into your emails before having to essentially be creative, right? Like set yourself into a creative mode. I found kind of this last month, I cannot read anything before I sit down to start writing because my brain goes that direction.
Yeah. And then it
Whether
distracts you, right? Because you're kind of thinking, oh yeah, I've got to do that later on. And then it's really hard to focus.
Right. So, and the hardest part is obviously with work because I want to do a good job. I'm the new guy here at Crowdfunding Nerds. Like, I want to do a good job, So it was really easy to look at my phone and be like, oh, okay, oh, Sean needed something. Oh, I'll message him real quick. It's like at 6:30 in the morning. It's like, but wait a minute, like now I'm breaking my own rule. It's like, wait, it's like Sean will wait. It's like unless it's like an emergency and he's like, get to me right now. It's like, okay, it can wait until I clock in. I know that's what you're expecting, because I do the same thing. And I try to note it's like, hey, don't worry about this until you get on. Don't stress this. I just had a question about, cost per million, or cost per 1,000. What do we do? Or whatever it is. But that was a really good point because I found myself reading the news. I found myself just kind of tooling around doing whatever and, feeding the dog and whatnot. And I realized I'm not setting myself up for success in the story because the story takes a large mental load, right? As far as maintaining what the characters sound like, excuse me, locations, what's the world look like? What am I trying to get across in this chapter? I can't do that when I'm thinking about world events or I'm thinking about work or I'm thinking about, it's like, I have to kind of protect that space. And something that kind of coined in my mind was I have to protect my imagination. And it goes deeper than just oh, well, for writing a story, it's I found I have to protect my imagination in what I'm consuming, right? Kind of guarding your heart and your mind, right? In what I'm taking in. There's a lot of mental junk food out there, there's a lot. And it comes in lots of different forms and even things that seem healthy, right? I think about it in terms of actual food. It's there are things that seem healthy. It's oh, there's a vegetable, there's, a protein, there's a grain. Okay, that seems healthy. But it's oh, but it's a burger from a fast food joint that, their animals are filled with hormones. They're the vegetable is a thin piece of iceberg lettuce on a giant bun and giant meat patties. I'm like that. There's some nutritional value in that, but long term, continuing to eat that will cause health issues, you know? So it's like, I need to treat my mind and my heart the same way, you know, especially because this story is geared towards a younger audience. This isn't a, you know, I don't particularly enjoy like heavily gruesome things and like, you know, the quote unquote adult entertain. I don't enjoy that at all. I find it sears my mind and the way I think. And because we're just kind of big sponges, really, like whatever we take in through our ears and our eyes, it's like it becomes a part of us. Like even what we eat becomes a part of us. That's been a statement forever. You are what you eat, right? It's the same thing with what we take in, you know, the types of media we consume and even how much media we consume really affects us. Just like how much food we consume really affects us. It's not even necessarily like what type, but if you're eating too much, that's shown that's detrimental. You know, it's like you need to, you know, making sure you have a balanced diet, right? And it's the same thing with our with what we take in our mind that I've kind of learned the only last month or so. And I kind of knew it. It's like, okay, when you're just scrolling through social media, you're doing it so mindlessly. But what happens is I've noticed is that my mind is just taking it in. There's all my safeguards are down. So whatever flashes across the screen, I'm like, I don't want that because I'm trying to accomplish a goal. So accomplishing a goal takes discipline, right? So part of that discipline is what am I taking into my mind? Because if I want to write this story for a young audience, like, okay, that is a big responsibility, right? And I don't want to betray my imagination in stumbling one of these little ones, right? Um, you know, like as a believer, I'm a Christian. I follow Jesus, and that was a warning. He's like, don't stumble these little ones. It's better for you to, you know, throw yourself off a bridge than it is to stumble one of these kids. It's like that's a heavy thing, you know. And I take it seriously.
Yeah, well,
So
I certainly think that
yeah.
like YouTube and social media is the bane to modern society in a lot of ways in terms of productivity, because you're exactly right. You really can get sucked in, and it can be difficult because sometimes I'm like, oh, I want to listen to a podcast on the background whilst I'm doing something, and then like you kind of find that you're drawn to what plays next or something catches, and you can go down a rabbit trail and you've lost time. And so, yeah, certainly being more self-aware and being disciplined is something that we all need to reflect upon, and something that I think everyone struggles with. So it's just any tips in terms of spending less time on social media?
Read books. I've been, in, that's one thing that kind of helped me. It's like, cause so for what I'm doing, you know, I'm writing a story. So I liken it to like a cup. Okay. So I'm writing a story. I'm pouring out what's in me into the story. So when it comes to like writer's block, when you think of like those blocks you run up against, a lot of times it's because we're empty, right? It's like we haven't filled that back in yet. So I found with writing, it's like, okay, if I'm not writing, which I've taken December off from like writing, it's like, okay, I finished the first draft and it's in the drawer, it's in the file on my computer, it's away. I'm not even going to look at it until January. So in the meantime, say, okay, well, fill yourself up. Okay, what am I going to fill myself up with then? Because again, whatever I'm taking in is what is being added to me. So I'm like, okay, I really want to read books that inspire, right? Read books that are in line with what I'm trying to do. So I've been actually reading Brandon Sanderson's Trust in the Emerald Sea, which it's kind of in line with the audience, right? It's kind of that middle grade age, young adult, kind of in there somewhere, which is really what I'm trying to write for. And so, like seeing him write, he's a great writer. He knows how to like paint a picture with like two sentences. Like, okay, that's exactly what I'm trying to do, you know. But then even books that just inspire creativity, right? whatever it might be. But again, just being selective about what I'm taking in, what I'm wanting to bring in myself, because whatever we bring in is what's going to come out, right? So
Yeah, don't read
that's what
tweets,
I've
read
found.
books.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's so funny because that's even something I noticed in social media. I'm like, oh, there's kind of this like cyclical thing that happens. Like, oh, people are kind of coming around like these ideas and things. I'm like, oh, that was talked. C.S. Lewis mentioned that back in the 40s, or 50s. It's like, oh, this thing. It's like, it's kind of the idea of if you don't learn history, you're kind of doomed to repeat it. It's like, because we haven't learned the lessons, right? So it's kind of that same thing. It's like reading classic books kind of lets you see like, oh, this isn't a new idea. It was something that was kind of left behind by, how by novelty, because something more novel came up, and I think there are a lot of benefits to social media. There's a lot of benefits, like even this, like we're able to get uh, information out there, right? When it comes to crowdfunding, when it comes to creativity, it's like we can reach a lot of people. It's I don't know. There's that balance between consuming and being someone who like gives, right? You're giving something. You're contributing to society. You're contributing to the world as a whole. And like, okay, because it's real easy to sit and consume. It's like, if I sit all day and I just eat junk food, it's like, okay, well, my body's going to adapt to that, and be really good at sitting on a couch, be really good at, taking naps all day. It's like, okay, it's the same is true. It's like, if I get up and I'm working out, frequently, it's like my body's like, oh, wait, okay, this is what we're doing now. And it's like, we want to get better at that thing. And it's the same thing with our minds, right? It's like, if you want to get better at being creative, finding things that are like cold media, where your brain has to fill in the gaps, right? Tends to be, you're gonna exercise that creative muscle, so to speak. Was it
Yes.
Sorry, Marshall McLuhan kind of coined this phrase of like hot and cold media. And that was something I found really interesting, is like hot media is anything that provides everything for you, like sight, sound, it doesn't require much of your brain to kind of piece things together. Like going to a movie theater would be like a hot media experience, right? Because there's the sound, it's all around you, there's beautiful visuals and things, and that's not bad. You can gain a lot from that. But then there's cold media, where like just listening to the radio, like your brain is kind of filling in a lot of the details. Like if somebody's talking, what they look like, right? Where are they? Your brain starts to, fill in those details. Same with reading a book, right? The only thing when you're reading a book is just your eyes are the only thing that's going, unless you're saying it out loud. But your brain starts to fill in those details, which is why I think movies adapted from books is disappointing, because the way because you mentioned you've been reading Redwall, or you were reading Redwall, how you visualize, Matthias is very different than how I visualize Matthias, right? Even though it's kind of off the same basis of what Brian Jacks is saying, but we have kind of different ideas,
It helps if you watch the animation first, and then you can kind of backwards engineer it.
Well, and that's something I noticed, because I watched Lord of the Rings before I read Lord of the Rings, and I kept like just going back to the movie. I'm like, well, it actually, it almost like cheapens it to some point, except for that there's enough in the book that wasn't in the movie that's like, okay, now I can really start seeing, what this looks like, what it looks like when a bunch of rangers in the movie is like,
actually, it's better in the movie. The change they made is actually better.
Right? Yeah, it's like you look at Rivendell, it's like, oh, that's way better than I thought,
Yeah.
or the Balrog or what have you,
Yeah, just the scene in Minas Tirith with Pippin, and he kind of twists the arrowhead, it goes down the well. That's not in the book, but that sort of he throws in the book. He throws a pebble in the pool, but it's the kind of explanation is was done later in the book. Like even the mithril reveal, it's done there in the tomb, whilst in the book it's when they actually leave Moria and Aragorn's inquiring of Frodo, why are you still alive? And
Right.
so like some of those things, it makes more sense that it's right there and then, as he's kind of being skewered by this weapon, that they inquire right there and then, not until they're out of Moria. So it's, there's some things that you kind of listening to when you're reading the book compared to the film, it's like, oh, the film actually did it better.
Right. Yeah. And it kind of just depends on, like, because that changes over time, right? Just like game design, or like game design has changed like every other year. There's like a new style that happens. And so it's like we look at games from like the 70s, like, oh, that's archaic and stuff. But at the time it was innovative, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even Tolkien writing Lord of the Rings, it's so heralded because he was very innovative at the time, and it's still influencing writers today, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you read it, you go back and read it, you're like, oh, Gandalf is explaining what happened at when he was at Rivendell, what happened when he met Saruman the White. It's just him talking about it. But in the movie, they like showed it. I'm like, okay, so that's the benefit of a visual medium. It's like, okay, we can actually show you exactly what happened, right?
Yeah. So one thing I'm hearing is in terms of discipline, and what you're describing here, is that your feelings shouldn't dictate your actions, but your actions should then dictate your feelings. So you kind of start off, I'm going to wake up at 5:00. I'm going to work for an hour and a half, and you might not feel like it, but you've sort of got the schedule, and eventually you will start adjusting, and your feelings will then start aligning with the schedule that you set yourself. Now suddenly you wake up at 5:00 and you're not tired and groggy because you're just so used to doing it, and you're able to work. And you're kind of making a conscious decision to cut off distractions like social media, not because you don't feel like it. You very much feel like just chilling and flicking doom scrolling, but you're making a conscious effort to deny your feelings so that you can focus on a greater principle, a greater task. Now, another thing I found that helpful when trying to work when you don't really want to work, for some reason, changing location can really help. And it can just be as little as you're in your office or your workspace, you just move to the lounge or something. You just be the other room,
right.
or like you set up in a different location. It's amazing how just changing location, suddenly you just become far more focused. I don't know why that's the case. There's probably some type of scientific explanation, but that's something I found quite helpful when you just kind of feel like you're in a rut. Just change location, and particularly if it's somewhat public, I think that kind of helps because I don't know. There's like for me, if I'm like out in the public area of my house, like my son can come over, look over my shoulder, and if I'm getting distracted, well, then he's getting distracted. I don't want him to be distracted. I want to make sure that when he comes over my shoulder, he's looking at something boring like my work. So that can be helpful.
I think there's that accountability, right? It's like, as a father and parents, like, you want to always show a good example. It's like, if I'm up here by myself, like, oh, I can spend some time listening to this podcast or this video or whatever, and then an hour later, like, oh wait, I was supposed to be doing something completely different. Because that's where my morning starts. I always start down in the kitchen table, where everyone's kind of coming through. It's like, okay, I can kind of focus here, because like I want to show. It's like, hey, they need to kids need to see their parents on task, or like, what's an example? Like, they mimic what we do. So if we show like, hey, this is something I have to do. I don't even necessarily want to do this right now, but I said I would. So I'm going to be a person of my word. They take that. I tell my wife, it's just putting it on the carousel. It may not manifest for another 3 years, but one day it'll come back around. So it's like they're, at least with my kids, it's like, oh, it's their minds are a carousel. Like, just put it on the carousel, it'll come back. Kind of teaching them the way they should go, right? It's like they may not do that right now, they may still struggle and whatnot, but it's like, that's in there somewhere. It doesn't just go away,
So yeah, I think getting accountability, so that can be something just like being a good role model for your children, but it could also be just having a friend or a mentor keep you accountable. I know that you had your father proofread your book. Was he ever keeping you accountable? Like, hey, son, where are you in this book? Have you finished chapter 3 yet? Come on, what are you doing? Did you have some type of external accountability kind of pushing you along?
I do. I've been a part of a small group for like 5 years. It all started with game development, game design. That's how I kind of got plugged in with them. and we are like, it's with the Christian Game Developers Conference, that group. And it's been great because they kind of supported me from like shifting from game design to like, you know what, I need to write this. Like, okay, like send us chapters then. Like, let us encourage you. And so we meet once a month. So there's kind of a built-in accountability just there. It's like, I need something to show them by the end of the month, you know, by our next meeting. So it's like, even if it's small, it's like I needed something. And that definitely helped before I was able to kind of, you know, get that discipline on my own to where now I just wake up and do it. But early on, it was like, okay, I need to show them something. So I can take 30 minutes, you know, I can take 20 minutes and like, okay, tweak something or write something. But that's been really great. And I still meet with them. They've been a great source of accountability for sure, because what is it? It's that idea. It's like with that camaraderie, right? You see someone else succeeding, like you kind of get that, you kind of feel that too. Like, oh man, I'm so glad for them. And it makes you want to succeed, you know, or finish something, whatever it might be. You know, if you don't let it become bitterness, right? Because there's that danger too. Like you can look at somebody who's doing the thing you want to do, right? And it can turn to bitterness. But in this group, it's like we're all at the same place. It's like we're all growing together. And there are people that, like, there's a guy in our group that is actively in the game design industry. He just he works with the Paw Patrol app. So like he's the art director for that project. Like, okay, he's in it, and he used to work for like Universal as a storyboard artist and all these things. It's like he's been in the industry where it's like, okay, I'm not at that level, but having somebody like that kind of pull you along, and then everyone's kind of together encouraging one another to doing the work, it's a huge boon. It's kind of the adage, like, no man is an island, right? It's like there's really kind of no such thing as a self-made man, right? Like you didn't invent English, or you didn't invent the language you speak. Other people did that. You didn't invent you didn't make the shoes you're wearing. Like somebody else did that. And even if you did, you got that from somebody else, right? You didn't invent shoes, you didn't invent clothes. You didn't invent the internet or whatever it is. It's like there's no such thing as a self-made person, right? So yeah, that's been a big help.
So you mentioned that you first started creating a comic from a comic to a tabletop game, and then you switched to a novel. What was the sort of catalyst that made those changes? Or why did you get to a point like comics going to be too expensive, and then I'm more interested in tabletop games now, or this tabletop game isn't very ingenuitive, I'm just going to move on to a novel? What was the thinking behind, like, because that's an interesting concept where you have like this overall theme and idea you want to communicate, but you keep on changing the medium.
Yeah, what I realized, because I can go back. So I originally was planning on going to school for visual effects and animation. Like that's what I wanted to do. But just, financially and just kind of go in a different direction, that didn't work out. So I was like, okay, I'll just kind of do it on my own. And me and a couple friends of mine, were like, we always wanted to open like a comic studio. Like, oh yeah, we can write. We have the skills to write, to do the art. We could do it, and it's like, all right, well, I'll just start writing. So I just started writing comics. I actually wrote like 6 issues of like a superhero type thing. And then through the course of, I met, married my wife, and we were having our first kid. And I'm like, I want to write something for them. And we used to have two pet rabbits at the time. And my wife, as amazing as she is, she would give me a prompt every morning. It's like, cause I just was like, I'm not sure what to do. She's like, oh, I'll just give you a prompt and you can write, you can draw, you can do whatever with that prompt. And I was like, okay, that sounds great. So one of those was lighthouse. I was like, okay, like that's kind of cool. So I drew a picture of a lighthouse and kind of got the idea from looking at my rabbits. Like, what would this be like from their perspective? And so that kind of got the ball rolling. And I was reading Redwall and stuff at the time. was like, that's a really interesting concept, like the world from just a different perspective, and understanding that, animal stories or stories with animals, like they kind of have this universal quality about them. So it's like, okay, well, I'm doing the comic book thing, so let me just try and like do this comic book. Um, and it was at the time where like graphic novels were getting really popular and stuff. And we lived in outside of Portland at the time. Dark Horse Comics was there, and like there was a lot happening, in like the graphic novel industry. It's like, okay, like so that's a possibility. Make a graphic novel of this. And in the course of that, my wife and I started playing games. I'm like, okay, like a graphic novel is great and all, but I wanted something more. It's like, yeah, like, because I read graphic novels, like, okay, I kind of go through it, but I don't feel necessarily connected to the story. Some people do. I wasn't feeling that. I'm like, okay, like, well, what else could we do? We were playing these board games, like Glenmore, Carcassonne. We were just kind of dabbling into it. I was like, well, that could be a fun route. Like, what if I made a game where you could kind of play the story, and like how you could, go on this adventure, and every time you play, it'd be slightly different based on your choices. I'm like, that's a cool idea, because we played like Descent and things like that as well. So like that's kind of a fun thing. Like it's something that people can actually experience, right? And so I was pursuing that for a long time. And what's interesting is that so fast forward, because I ended up putting that down. Like my son had some, even from a young age, had a lot of learning disabilities and things. So it's like, okay, I got to put this all aside, focusing on my family and stuff. Like that's another time. So, a decade later, it's like, okay, I think I have time to do this. Right. I kind of became like a stay-at-home dad. My wife was working from home. So like, hey, I actually have some time to kind of do this. All right. So I picked up the game design back up, but Convergence of Fireflies, the story is always kind of like was like The Hobbit to Lord of the Rings, right? Convergence was like the prequel to what's happening in the game. They're kind of, they stand apart. But if for people who liked the world, oh, there's a game here, like, or people who like the game, oh, there's a prequel book that goes with that, was the idea. And I was kind of just doing both at the same time, but I only had so many hours in the day, and I wasn't going to sacrifice my time with my family. So I was like, okay, well, one of these have to give. So I was like, you know what? The game, I keep running into roadblocks because I have to write the lore of this world or whatever it is. Like, well, why don't I just do that? So the game is still an
Okay.
option. Like I still have it. I got pretty far on it, but it's like, you know what? I want to write the story. I want to do this. And so we've just been like, okay, well, what can we do with the story then once it's written? And so that's kind of where we're tooling around with options right now. And so we're kind of playing around with that at the moment. So, but the game is still like on my shelf. It's still sitting there like, okay, it's an idea, but it's really helped to set it aside and focus on the world itself. So
Yeah, I think what you're trying to capture is an experience, right? You want someone to experience this world, and what's the best method of, or best means in which people can experience it? Is it through a comic? Is it through a game? Was it through just reading a novel? So that's interesting. And that might be part of the motivation we talk about, is like, what experience do you want other people to have? And that could certainly motivate you to keep on going when things get tough. It reminds me of Tolkien, where he clearly created these fictitious languages, like elf and dwarf and these these other things. And then he sort of, he created a world in which those languages could exist, and everything kind of went from there. And then, it became what it is today, the Lord of the Rings and this big epic saga. So yeah, it's funny how this all transpired. So Donnie, if people want to follow your work, or if they want to encounter and read your book, or follow along, I know that you just did the first draft, so you still have lots of work to do. But where can they sort of find you, and where can they kind of just connect with you?
Yeah. So our website is worldofserafima.com. So Serafima is spelled Serafima. You just go there. There's a little email sign up. So you just sign up for the newsletter there. We're looking at, we're still working on a few things, but there's like some free things we want to be able to give out to people, down the line here as things we kind of settle things in. Cause again, like I said, we're kind of taking a break this month, but worldofserafima.com is where you can kind of follow along. I do a newsletter that kind of gives you insight to what's going on with the projects, both Convergence of Fireflies and the game. When the game picks back up, that'll be a place to get more information on that. But right now it's focusing on Convergence of Fireflies. And I like to give little hints and glimpses. I do little blurbs from a character, their perspective in the world. And so it kind of gives you little hints and glimpses of the world. If you don't want to know that, you just kind of want to know the project process or where things are at. Everything's kind of broken up. So you can kind of skip that part if you want to. And but yeah, that'd be the best place to get more information, worldofserafima.com.
Great. So in terms of our tips, in terms of overcoming large obstacles which you don't really want to, I suppose the outline would be to gradually set up disciplines in which you are setting yourself schedules and even a timer that you're going to work on a project for so long, so often, cutting out distractions, changing location, being accountable to other people, exterior people, whether that's just being a good role model to your friends and family, or if that's actually having someone who's kind of like as you said, like a network of people who you meet once a month and you kind of hold each other accountable. And then finally, I think it's just thinking of the over experience that you want people to have, and then that being a motivating factor, just helping you get things done. Is there anything else you want to add to this list, or anything else you want to kind of finish up with?
Yeah. Find the moment that you're most creative, whatever that is during your day. Like, because I know some people are really creative at night. Mine just happened to be in the morning. Then also, like, pursue those weird little interests that you like. Like, I really have been enthralled with like falconry and that idea of like hunting with birds and things. And I haven't done it yet, but I actually found a guy up here that works with birds of prey. So we're actually going to be able to do something with him. And like, I find those little things that are kind of quirky, that you enjoy doing, that aren't, you're not looking to make a profession out of it or anything like that, or monetize it, but you're just like, I find that really interesting. I love learning about how like animals work and how nature works. And so it's just really inspiring. But I'd also just remind what you said, Sean, like sometimes you need to shake it up, right? It's like, if you're in one position all the time, like, I started laying down on the floor for work. It's like, because it put my mind in a different perspective. So I was able to focus better on, the things I needed to do for Crowdfunding Nerds. And I'll probably change that up soon, but not being afraid to shake things up. I go for walks with my dog, just go outside. And I think a lot of people have said that, but there's something about just getting outside of your normal space that helps kind of jar that creativity, kind of shake up the sediment so it can get out, so definitely add those few things to that list as well. And keep it fun.
Yes.
Like it's
I forgot to mention that.
Like, so if you're making a game's supposed to be fun, right? If you're writing music is supposed to, you enjoy it, right? It invokes something. If you're writing a book, enjoy the writing process. Sean, you're writing courses. This is stuff a lot about, like you can find the fun in that,
Yeah, strange. It's a strange mental block. I think it's because it's the course is actually done now. So now it's doing all the editing and the mix and mastering of the audio and the overlays and effects and things, and then exporting it and uploading it and type. So there's a lot to do, and I think all those steps seem very daunting for some reason, like mentally. So it's been very challenging for me just to be consistent. And I think my key problem is we've addressed it here, where I'm trying to do it at the end of my day. Once I've done all my kind of responsibilities, when I probably should be setting aside time before my day starts, where my head's clear and I can sit down and do a good, solid 40 minutes or an hour of this, and then I can say, well, I did a little today, and I can put it away, and then if I have time at the end of the day, come back to it. So that's really good. That's my big takeaway right now for myself in doing this, is just setting aside time before the day starts and not even checking my emails until I actually get some work done. I think that's a really good kind of tip I've got from your experience writing this book.
Awesome, man. Yeah, that's how I found, like, I call it protecting my imagination, right? It's like just protecting what's happening here. Just like a bodybuilder, like, is careful about what they put in the tank, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's the same sort of thing. It's all about what you're taking in,
Well, thanks, Donnie. I think that we'll leave it there for today, and we'll let Robot Richard sign us out.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week's episode of Crowdfunding Nerds. For more resources, articles, and to listen to past podcasts, please visit us at crowdfundingnerds.com. And if you have a crowdfunding question, we also have a page on our site where you can send a message directly to us. Please visit crowdfundingnerds.com/question. And if your question is a great question, we may include it in a future podcast. Thank you all again for listening to this week's episode, and we'll see you next week. Stay nerdy.